She was the kind of performer who could get a laugh just by walking into frame. No line required. Millions of Americans let her into their living rooms every week and felt, somehow, like they knew her. They didn't. Behind the beloved characters and the chaotic charm of live television was a woman quietly battling an eating disorder she disclosed to almost no one, a marriage that arrived like a rescue, and finally, a cancer diagnosis that doctors dismissed for months before it was too late to fully stop. Her memoir would later call her illness "Always Something," a punchline turned into a eulogy. This is the story of how comedy's most beloved original star lived two lives at once, and how the second one finally caught up with the first. Gilda Radner was born in Detroit in 1946, into a family with enough money to buy her almost anything except the one thing she actually wanted, which was for her father to stay alive. Herman Radner ran a hotel and doted on his daughter, nicknaming her Pig, with the kind of affection that only sounds strange until you understand what it meant between them. He would take her to the theater, encourage her impressions of the guests downstairs, and let her believe, for a while, that she could be anyone she wanted. Then, when Gilda was 14, he died of a brain tumor, and the girl who had built her entire personality around making her father laugh suddenly had no one left to perform for. She found a substitute almost immediately. Comedy became the thing that filled the silence her father left behind, not a hobby so much as a survival strategy. Records from her school years describe a chubby, anxious teenager who discovered that if she made people laugh fast enough, they didn't have time to notice anything else about her. Her mother, meanwhile, was fixated on Gilda's weight, enrolling her in diet camps and diet doctors from an alarmingly young age, sowing a seed that would take root far more destructively later in her life. It was, in hindsight, an origin story built entirely out of two lessons: that love could disappear without warning, and that her body was always up for public discussion. By the time she reached the University of Michigan, Gilda had already found her real classroom, the stage. She drifted from her studies toward Toronto's Second City Improv troupe, then into the National Lampoon Radio Hour alongside a cluster of future comedy legends, absorbing the specific, unglamorous craft of making strangers laugh on command, night after night, for years before anyone outside the business knew her name. Colleagues from this period remember someone almost unnervingly generous on stage, content to feed another performer the punchline rather than take it herself, a rare trait in a business built on ego. It made her beloved. It also meant she rarely said no to anyone who needed her to be funny, warm, or endlessly available, a pattern that would follow her for the rest of her life. When NBC launched a new late-night sketch show in October 1975, nobody quite knew what they had, least of all the network executives who nearly canceled it in its first uneasy weeks. What they had, among other things, was Gilda Radner, the only performer hired before anyone else on the cast, reportedly at Lorne Michaels' insistence that Saturday Night Live could not exist without her. She arrived on screen fully formed: Rosanna Dana, with her tabloid-grade grievances; Emily Latella, mishearing the news with total conviction; Baba Wawa, mangling her R's into legend. Within a single season, she was, by wide consensus among critics and castmates alike, the breakout star of the most dangerous show on television. Backstage told a different story than the one America was watching. The original cast worked absurd hours, fueled by adrenaline, and, as has been extensively documented since, a chemical culture that ran through 1970s Rockefeller Center like a second script nobody had written down. Gilda was, by every account, at the center of it. Beloved, magnetic, the person other cast members singled out decades later as the true heart of the show. John Belushi reportedly refused to do a sketch without her blessing on it. Chevy Chase called her, simply, the best of them. And yet the woman making 8 million people laugh every Saturday night was quietly waging a private campaign against her own body. Friends noticed she barely ate on shooting days, then vanished after meals. Nobody used the word bulimia out loud in 1976. The term barely existed in the public conversation. So what colleagues clocked instead was simply a brilliant, exhausting woman who seemed unable to sit still with herself, always performing, rarely resting, never quite satisfied with how she looked, no matter how the audience adored her. There was a night, cast members later recalled, when Gilda staged an entire elaborate bit purely to avoid a wardrobe fitting she dreaded, roping half the crew into the ruse, without any of them realizing what she was actually avoiding. It became, retold at parties for years afterward, one of those classic Radner stories. Chaotic, hilarious, entirely improvised. Nobody watching her invent an excuse on the spot could have guessed the excuse was protecting a wound. By the time she left Saturday Night Live in 1980, Gilda Radner was, by any measure, one of the most beloved comedians in America. Magazine profiles called her fearless. Audiences wrote to her as though she were a friend. What none of them could see was the quiet arithmetic she'd been running for years. How much of herself she was allowed to keep, and how much belonged to the laugh. The applause never stopped, but somewhere behind it, a much smaller and much older war kept going. Gilda would later write about it herself, plainly and without flinching, in the pages of her own memoir, a private struggle with an eating disorder that had begun in childhood and simply refused to leave with her adolescence, tightening its grip instead each time her fame grew a little larger. She was, by her own account years later, a woman who could stand in front of a live studio audience of a few hundred people and millions more at home, utterly fearless, and then go home and lose an entire evening to a ritual she never spoke about to anyone. It was an era, colleagues later reflected, that offered women in comedy exactly two acceptable shapes to be funny in: plain enough to be harmless, or thin enough to be forgiven for being loud. Gilda occupied neither comfortably. Producers and network executives, according to people close to the show, made comments about her weight that would be unthinkable to say aloud today. She absorbed them, joked about them on stage before anyone else could, and kept the real cost of that joke to herself. Friends noticed things, in fragments, without ever assembling the full picture. A director recalled that she disappeared for stretches during rehearsals no one could quite account for. A castmate remembered a birthday cake that went almost entirely untouched, then vanished from its plate the following morning. None of them, by their own later admission, understood in the moment what they were watching. This was not an age that had a vocabulary for it, and Gilda, master of every voice but her own, never volunteered one. It bled, inevitably, into her private life. 2 marriages in her 20s came and went, both brief, both quietly strained by a woman who gave the world everything and kept almost nothing in reserve for the people meant to know her best. She would later describe herself, with the same self-deprecating honesty that made America love her, as someone who had spent years being funny for a living and lonely for free. The question that trails her through this part of her story is not whether anyone loved her. Plainly, many people did, but whether she ever let any of them see the parts of herself that weren't performing. That answer, for now, remained locked away. It would take a different kind of crisis entirely to finally pull it into the light. On the set of a forgettable 1982 comedy called Hanky Panky, Gilda Radner met a co-star who would change the entire trajectory of her private life. Gene Wilder was, by his own later admission, deeply reluctant to work with her at all, having heard she was difficult. Within days of shooting together, he found himself, in his words, unable to stop thinking about her. She, for her part, later said she fell for him almost the moment he corrected her grip on a prop gun with a gentleness she wasn't used to receiving from anyone, let alone a man. Their courtship unfolded slowly and, by the standards of Gilda's earlier romantic life, almost old-fashioned. Wilder was 12 years her senior, twice divorced, famously private, and entirely unimpressed by fame for its own sake, which colleagues noted was precisely what drew Gilda to him after a decade of being adored by strangers and known by almost no one. They married in September of 1984, in a small civil ceremony in France, with only a handful of friends present, a deliberate contrast to the media circus that had followed nearly every other chapter of her public life. For a while, it looked, from the outside, like the story had finally arrived at its happy ending. Friends described a genuine partnership, 2 comedians who understood, better than most spouses could, exactly what the job cost a person. Wilder later wrote that marrying Gilda felt like coming home to someone who had been waiting for him his entire life, though he was careful to add that home, in her case, came with its own weather systems. She began stepping back from the frantic pace of the previous decade, choosing film roles more selectively, talking openly for the first time about wanting a quieter life, maybe even children. But records of this period also show something else moving quietly underneath the domestic calm. The eating disorder she had carried since adolescence had not disappeared simply because she was finally, visibly happy. If anything, those closest to her later admitted they had hoped marriage might fix what therapy and fame never had, and it hadn't. Gilda herself, with the same unsparing honesty she brought to everything else, would eventually write that arriving at real love did not automatically switch off years of learned self-punishment. It merely gave her, for the first time, someone worth trying to get better for. That effort, and everything else in her newly quiet life, was about to be tested in a way neither of them could have anticipated. The exhaustion she'd been chalking up to stress, the digestive troubles she'd been dismissing for months, were about to demand an explanation no one in that house was prepared to hear. It began, as these things so often do, with a symptom nobody took seriously enough. Through 1985 and into 1986, Gilda complained of fatigue that sleep couldn't fix, of stomach pain that came and went without explanation, of a strange, persistent sense that something in her body had quietly gone wrong. She brought these complaints to doctor after doctor, and doctor after doctor sent her home reassured, or referred her instead to a therapist, on the theory that a woman with her history of anxiety was probably just anxious again. For nearly 10 months, by later accounts from her own medical team, her ovarian cancer grew undiagnosed beneath a diagnosis of stress. It is one of the darker ironies of her story that the very reputation she'd spent a career cultivating, funny, high-strung, a little dramatic, may have worked against her in the one moment she needed to be taken at her word. Wilder later said, with visible frustration even years afterward, that he watched his wife get steadily sicker while being told, repeatedly, that nothing was wrong. The actual diagnosis, when it finally arrived in October of 1986, came almost by accident, during an unrelated scan that happened to catch what months of appointments had missed. Ovarian cancer, and not in its earliest stage. Gilda would later describe the moment of hearing the word out loud as strangely quiet, almost anticlimactic, compared to the years of vague dread that had preceded it, as if some part of her had already known. What followed was immediate and brutal: surgery, then an aggressive course of chemotherapy that stripped away her hair, her energy, and for long stretches, her ability to work at all. She lost weight rapidly, the same body she'd spent 2 decades trying to control, now betraying her in a way no diet or ritual could touch. Friends visiting during this period described someone almost unrecognizable physically, and yet, they insisted, still unmistakably herself, cracking jokes about her own chemotherapy from a hospital bed, refusing, even now, to let the room stay heavy for long. Wilder rarely left her side. Colleagues remember him canceling projects without hesitation, sleeping in hospital chairs, learning to manage a level of caregiving nobody had prepared him for. It was, by every account, the deepest test either of them had faced, and the same quiet, private devotion that had drawn them together in the first place was now the only thing standing between Gilda and total isolation in her illness. What almost no one outside that hospital room yet understood was that Gilda herself was about to turn this ordeal into the most unflinchingly honest work of her career. Somewhere in the middle of chemotherapy, propped up in a hospital bed with an IV in one arm, Gilda Radner started writing again. Not sketches this time, but the truth. She would eventually call the manuscript "It's Always Something," borrowing the line from her own Rosanna Dana, and turning a punchline she'd invented years earlier into the title of the most honest thing she ever put her name to. The book, published in 1989, did something almost nobody in her position had done publicly before. It described ovarian cancer in plain, unglamorous detail, the misdiagnoses, the fear, the indignities of treatment, without once losing her sense of humor about any of it. She wrote about vomiting into a bucket mid-laugh at her own joke. She wrote about losing her hair and deciding to throw a party to shave the rest of it off herself, rather than let cancer take that decision from her too. Reviewers at the time called it unflinching. Readers, especially other cancer patients, called it something closer to a lifeline. Disclosure had never come easily to Gilda. For over a decade, she had hidden an eating disorder from an adoring public. Now, faced with a disease with no polite way to conceal it, she chose instead to hand the story over willingly, on her own terms, in her own voice. Friends noted the shift as almost startling. The same woman who had spent years performing a version of herself now insisting on being seen exactly as she was, bald and frightened and still, unmistakably funny. It was during this period, according to people close to her, that Gilda first spoke about wanting something to exist for other cancer patients that had not existed for her. A place built specifically around the idea that humor and community were not distractions from illness, but essential tools for surviving it. She mentioned it in passing to friends, in letters, in conversations at the hospital, an idea without a name yet, born entirely out of what she had needed and not been able to find. Treatment continued through 1988 into 1989, a grinding cycle of remission and recurrence that left doctors increasingly guarded in what they would promise her. Wilder later said he understood, by the early months of that final year, that his wife was not going to beat this, and that she likely understood it too, though neither of them said so aloud for as long as they could manage not to. By the spring of 1989, the cancer that had gone into remission once before returned with a force doctors could no longer meaningfully push back. Gilda spent much of her final months at home, in the quiet house she shared with Wilder in Connecticut, a world away from the studio lights and roaring audiences that had defined her 20s. Visitors during this period described the strange, almost gentle stillness of it. A woman who had spent her career unable to stop performing, now content, for the first time, to simply rest. Wilder's devotion in these final months has since become one of the most quietly told parts of her story. He canceled work, stayed almost constantly at her side, learned the rhythms of her medication and her pain the way he had once learned his lines. Friends recalled him reading to her, sitting with her through nights when sleep wouldn't come, absorbing a kind of caregiving that had nothing theatrical about it at all. No audience, no punchline, just two people running out of time together. He would later say that those months taught him more about love than the previous 50 years of his life combined. On the morning of May 20th, 1989, Gilda Radner died at a hospital in Los Angeles, with Wilder beside her. She was 42 years old. News of her death broke swiftly across a country that had, in some sense, never stopped thinking of her as the young woman doing impressions in a New York studio a decade earlier. Tributes arrived almost immediately from the colleagues who had built that studio's legend alongside her, castmates calling her, again and again, in nearly identical language, the funniest and kindest person any of them had ever worked with. Lorne Michaels reportedly said the show never fully replaced what she brought to it, not because no one else was talented, but because no one else was her. Newspapers ran her photograph beside her characters, as though unsure which version of her the public was actually mourning. In truth, it was both, the performer who had made an entire nation laugh on command, and the woman underneath her, who had spent decades fighting battles the audience never saw, and had only, in her final years, allowed anyone to witness. There is a particular symmetry, largely unremarked upon at the time, in the fact that a girl who lost her father to cancer at 14 would herself die of it at 42, having spent the interval learning, slowly and at great cost, how to stop performing wellness she didn't feel. Her death left a very specific kind of silence, not just grief at losing a beloved performer, but the unfinished shape of an idea she had mentioned to friends from her hospital bed, an idea about community and cancer and laughter that she had not lived long enough to build herself. That task now fell to the people who had loved her, and to a promise nobody had quite made out loud, but everybody understood needed keeping. In 1995, 6 years after her death, a group of Gilda's closest friends made good on the promise nobody had spoken aloud in her hospital room. Gene Wilder, along with psychologist Joanna Bull, who had counseled Gilda through her final years, and a small circle of collaborators, opened the first Gilda's Club in New York City, a free support community built around the specific idea Gilda herself had described from her sickbed, that laughter and community were not a distraction from cancer, but a legitimate part of surviving it. The model was deliberately different from anything that had existed before. There were no waiting rooms, no clinical fluorescent lighting, no hushed voices. Gilda's club spaces were designed to feel like homes, living rooms with couches instead of gurneys, kitchens where people could make tea, meeting rooms named after Gilda's own characters. Support groups ran alongside comedy workshops, art classes, and what founders described, only half-jokingly, as the right to laugh, even here. Bull would later say the entire philosophy could be traced directly back to conversations she'd had with Gilda in those final hospital months, when Gilda kept returning to the same complaint. that everyone treated cancer like something you had to face in silence, and she had never once believed that was true. The idea spread faster than anyone anticipated. By the early 2000s, additional clubhouses had opened across the country: Chicago, Seattle, Kansas City, and eventually dozens of chapters nationwide, each one free to attend, each one built on the same founding principle. In 2009, the organization merged with the wellness community to form what is now known as the Cancer Support Community, one of the largest cancer support networks in the United States, still operating today under a mission statement that reads, almost word for word, like something Gilda might have said herself in an interview 20 years earlier. Gene Wilder never remarried in the years immediately following her death, and for a long time rarely discussed her publicly at all. Friends said the grief simply ran too deep for casual conversation. When he finally did speak about her at length, in interviews, and later in his own memoir, Kiss Me Like a Stranger, he described their marriage not as the tragic ending audiences assumed it must have been, but as the years he considered, without qualification, the happiest of his entire life. He credited her, more than any role he ever played, with teaching him what it meant to be fully known by another person. He went on to write children's books and occasionally acted, but colleagues noted he kept a photograph of Gilda on set with him for the rest of his career, a small, private ritual nobody asked him to explain. Her professional legacy, meanwhile, only grew louder with time. Successive generations of Saturday Night Live cast members have cited her specifically as the reason they wanted to do comedy at all, a direct, unbroken line running from Rosanna Dana through decades of female comedians who followed. Tina Fey has spoken about her influence, so has Amy Poehler. Retrospectives of the show's original era consistently single Gilda out not merely as talented, but as the emotional center around which the entire ensemble organized itself, the person whose approval mattered more than the audience's. And yet the fuller portrait that has emerged in the decades since her death is more complicated, and in some ways more moving, than the one audiences knew in real time. The eating disorder she hid for over a decade behind a career built on making people laugh has become, in hindsight, its own quiet cautionary note about what the industry asked of women even at the height of their fame. The illness that killed her forced open a conversation about diagnostic delay and dismissed symptoms in women's health that outlived her by decades. And the club built in her name has, by its own internal count, served hundreds of thousands of families since 1995, a number Gilda herself never lived to see, built from an idea she barely had time to finish describing. There is a particular kind of symmetry to how her story closes. A girl who lost her father to cancer at 14, who spent a lifetime performing so no one would look too closely at what she was carrying, ultimately died of the same disease that first taught her comedy could be armor, and left behind, almost by accident, a permanent place for other people to put that armor down. It is not, in the end, simply the story of a comedian who happened to get sick. It is the story of what happens when the very qualities that make someone beloved, the generosity, the relentless performing, the refusal to let a room stay heavy, are also the qualities that let her hide, for years, exactly how much she was carrying alone. Gilda Radner spent her life turning private pain into something the rest of us could laugh at safely. In the end, it may be the one thing she never learned to do for herself. That's the story of Gilda Radner, comedy's brightest star, and the quiet cost behind it. Let me know in the comments who you'd like to see covered next.